In the year 1574, a French ambassador stood in the Ottoman court, forced to witness something so revolting that it made him physically ill. Before his eyes, a slave was punished for attempting escape, not with a swift execution, but with a method that stretched across 3 long days. Slowly, deliberately, the victim was skinned alive. The ambassador's name was Javo, and the journals he left behind contained some of the most unsettling accounts of Ottoman punishments. But his testimony was not unique. Other diplomats, court records, and even survivor accounts confirm what he described. This was not random cruelty. It was a carefully designed system of terror, perfected over centuries, meant to break the human spirit. The Ottoman Empire did not simply own slaves, it dominated millions. At its height, around 2.5 million people were in bondage. They were not just prisoners of war. They were farmers, artisans, children, and entire families taken during raids across Europe, Africa, and Asia. But the true horror was not in the numbers. It was in the way the empire kept them obedient. Every punishment was calculated, every death staged with purpose. The goal was simple: to ensure rebellion never took root. The punishment Chavo described became infamous. It was called gradual flaying. This was reserved for those who tried to escape or dared encourage others to resist. The process was not meant to kill quickly. It was designed to drag on, a public ordeal meant to instill terror in everyone who witnessed it. The condemned would be chained to a wooden frame, set in full view of other slaves. Executioners carried knives crafted for precision, and with them, they peeled away the skin in thin strips, starting with the fingers and toes. They avoided major blood vessels, making sure the victim remained alive and conscious. On the first day, the hands and feet. On the second, the arms and legs. By the third, the torso and face. The victim's screams would echo through the courtyard, but the pain was not the only weapon. Other slaves were forced to watch, forbidden to look away. Anyone who showed sympathy risked facing the same fate. The message was clear. Escape was not just impossible, it was unthinkable. Another punishment was equally horrifying, though in a different way. It was called living burial. This was inflicted on those who stole from their masters or damaged property. At first, it almost seemed merciful to outsiders, but in truth, it was a slow-motion nightmare. The condemned was paraded before the other slaves and forced to confess their crime. Then, handed a shovel, they dug their own grave 6 feet deep, 3 feet wide, measured precisely by Ottoman guards. These dimensions were no accident. They were specified in official manuals. Hours passed as the slave dug, while others carried on their daily work nearby, forced to ignore the looming spectacle. When the whole was complete, the condemned was given what appeared to be a final kindness, a last meal, a chance to pray. But the food was laced with heavy salt, ensuring they would be consumed by thirst. Then came the burial. The slave was lowered into the pit and buried up to the neck, the soil packed tightly around the body. A wooden collar was fixed around the throat so the victim could not slip deeper into the earth and hasten to their own death. And then the waiting began. The Ottomans did not leave them to perish quickly. Instead, they provided small rations of water, just enough to prolong life, but never enough to ease the torment. Records show some victims lingered for a week, even 10 days. Other slaves had to pass by the grave daily, hearing the cries for mercy, the prayers, the desperate attempts at conversation. Each day, the voice grew weaker, until it faded into delirium. Day 1 was filled with defiance. Day 2 brought bargaining, promises of loyalty. By the third day, the victim begged for death. Beyond that came hallucinations, rambling, conversations with ghosts of the past, and all of it, every moment, was part of the theater of fear. The third method was known as the White Death. This was reserved for those accused of poisoning their masters or plotting rebellion. It was a punishment that required knowledge of medicine, because it was rooted in chemistry, the deliberate poisoning of the body with salt. The victim was strapped to a chair, mouth forced open with a wooden device, hands bound to prevent vomiting. Every 2 hours they were fed a measured portion of salt, mixed with just enough water to swallow. The dosage was precise, calculated to cause maximum pain, while too much salt would kill too quickly. Too little would allow recovery. The balance kept the victim suffering for 5 to 7 days. The body's cells shriveled from dehydration, muscles locked in painful cramps so violent that bones sometimes snapped. Seizures shook the body. The eyes dried to the point that the victim could no longer blink. Their tongue swelled, their lips cracked open, their skin split from lack of moisture. But the Ottomans did not stop at physical pain. The salt was served on fine china, as though it were a royal feast. Guards mocked the victim, asking if they enjoyed their dinner, describing in detail the real meals others were eating: bread, stews, cool water. Fellow slaves were forced to assist, cleaning the plates, restraining the victim during seizures, made unwilling accomplices to the horror. The end came when the kidneys failed. But until the very last hours, the victim remained aware, begging for water in a broken, rasping voice barely recognizable as human speech. Another punishment was called gradual compression. It was used on those who attacked overseers or tried to lead uprisings. The condemned was chained to a platform, and heavy stones were placed on their chest one by one. The sound of ribs snapping was announced by guards for all to hear, each stone added during the day, while slaves were forced to continue their labor to the sound of strained, gasping breaths. Death came slowly, often after 8 to 10 hours, when the lungs finally collapsed. Then there was prolonged impalement, a calculated refinement of a punishment already infamous. The stake was angled to avoid major organs, ensuring the victim lived 2 or 3 days suspended in agony. Other slaves were required to provide small amounts of water, prolonging the torment. In doing so, they faced the impossible choice of showing mercy that extended suffering or withholding it and risking punishment themselves. The impaled body stood as a constant reminder, visible from the living quarters and workyards, ensuring no one forgot the price of disobedience. The bronze treatment awaited those who destroyed property or documents. The victim was strapped to a table while bronze plates were glowing red, then pressed against the flesh for timed intervals. Cold water was poured over the burns not to heal, but to intensify the pain and prevent unconsciousness. Other slaves were forced to stoke the fires, ensuring their complicity in the process. These punishments were not improvised. They were codified in law, recorded in detail, studied for effectiveness. Ottoman officials tracked survival times, measured fear responses, and refined techniques like scientists testing experiments. This was not chaos, it was order, designed to make rebellion not just unlikely, but unimaginable. And the system worked. The empire ruled millions of slaves with almost no large-scale uprisings. Not because the enslaved accepted their fate, but because they had seen what happened to those who resisted. The machinery of fear had done its work. Slavery in the Ottoman Empire was not abolished until 1908, and even then, it was not out of compassion. The empire's finances were collapsing, and European pressure made the system unsustainable. The last recorded use of these punishments was as late as 1903. But what is perhaps most chilling is that the 6 methods we know of may have only been the beginning. Newly opened archives, sealed for more than a century, hint at punishments so brutal even Ottoman officials refused to record them in detail. Archaeologists have found strange tools and chemical traces at former slave sites that do not match any known practices. If flaying, salt poisoning, and living burials were only the methods we know, what horrors remain hidden? How many punishments were erased from history, too terrible to leave behind, even in records of cruelty? The Ottoman system shows us how far a state can go in using fear as a weapon, how pain can be engineered, studied, and perfected to strip away not only freedom, but hope itself. And it leaves us with one final question. How many other civilizations created their own unseen systems of human destruction, systems we may never uncover?